Hello and welcome. My apologies for starting late to everyone. We had some technological problems. I'm Jennifer Dorr, a member of the Montclair Public Library Foundation and co-founder of the Open Book, Open Mind series. The library is currently expanding its digital offerings to the community, offering curbside pickup for books, and even delivering hardcover books to homebound seniors to meet the challenges of the pandemic. All of this is very expensive. So we're really grateful to those of you who purchased a ticket to this event today, and we ask you to keep giving to your public library. I've been given the daunting task of introducing Christina Baker Kline in 4 minutes. I could talk about Christina's work for hours. Her novels have received the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, and a Barnes & Noble Discover Award. If you know Christina, which you might, because we Montclairians like to claim her as our own despite the recent move, you know that she's a tireless advocate for other writers and for what's right. She's a board member of the Center for Fiction, the Maine's Jessup Library, and Succeed Together's Montclair Literary Festival. And she was one of our inaugural authors in this Open Book, Open Mind series. This is her third appearance in the Open Book, Open Mind series. Like Evangeline and Hazel, characters in The Exiles, Christina steps forward to help her friends and speaks out when she spies injustice. Now that she's published her 8th book, we can see Christina has embarked on a grand project to restore women's experiences to history, to allow us to hear voices that the dominant narrative has drowned out. Christina resists happy endings, but always leaves us with a thread of hope. Okay, I'm going on too long, especially since we started late. But before I go, I'd like to encourage you to use your ticket credit toward buying The Exiles from Watchung Booksellers if you have not done so already. Buying the book from Watchung keeps authors coming to Montclair, both virtually and in person. But buy it because it's really good. I could not put The Exiles down. You can easily access a link to buy the book today on both your cheat sheet and your relevant reads handouts. Welcome, Christina.
Hey, I'm here.
Awesome. Now it's my pleasure to introduce another advocate for writers and writing, Jacqueline Morose, founder and director of Succeed Together's Montclair Literary Festival, and an award-winning science writer who has authored Girl Talk and Scattered Seeds. The Literary Festival is the library's partner in producing this event today. Thank you, and thanks for your patience with the technological problems. Hand it over to you, Jackie.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
I'm thrilled to help close out the Montclair Literary Festival with this event. The festival is sponsored by and benefits Succeed Together, which provides free educational services to low-income children. I'd like to thank the library, which has been a wonderful partner to us for both the free tutoring program and the festival. If you'd like to support Succeed Together and the Literary Festival by donating or sponsoring, go to succeedtogether.org. Now I'm excited to introduce Courtney Sullivan. She is the New York Times bestselling author of Friends and Strangers, as well as 6 other highly acclaimed novels. Courtney's writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, New York Magazine, Elle, Real Simple, and Oprah Magazine, among many others. Massachusetts native, Courtney was in New York and is now back in her hometown. Welcome to Courtney. And hi, Christina.
Hi. There we are.
Yay, we're all here.
Great.
Hi.
Oh my God. What a wonderful gathering.
Yes. I'm so glad to see you, Christina.
I'm so glad to see you too. And I'm sorry to everyone for the delay, but we promise we'll make it up to you and it'll be fun and entertaining. Can't wait.
I just want to say before we start, Courtney and Christina, and thank you so much to everyone in the audience for waiting. I just want to make sure that everybody knows how to ask questions. So my librarian co-host Molly Hone, who's behind the scenes, is going to share her screen with us and just show you how to ask questions in GoToWebinar. So as you can see, they look different on the cell phone, the tablet, and the computer, but what you're looking for on the cell phone and the tablet is a question mark. And then on the computer, there's an area down below that says questions. And with that, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you two have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello. Well, now
Hello.
my dog is barking because that's the magic of live theater. But I almost don't even know where to begin with this book, honestly, Christina, because you know, you and I have known each other a long time, and we are friends. And when you read a friend's novel, you know, it's great if you really like it. But I love this book. I am obsessed with this book. As you know, I read it in one day, which is very difficult. I have a almost 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, so I really don't have that. I usually have to like sneak it in when I'm reading a novel, but I was just completely absorbed into this story. And also, it's one of those books that just stays with you. You know, I still think about it all the time. And I just think it is such a feat of storytelling. And it's kind of, we don't see books like this very often. So I just love it. It's wonderful. And
It's kind of old fashioned. I know what you mean.
it is old fashioned. Yeah,
it is.
in the
It's a
best
real
way.
story. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And there, you know, one thing that I think about a lot with modern fiction is, are there high stakes for the characters in a book? You know, a lot of times we read a novel and the writing is great and the characters are great, but what are the stakes? You know, is it really going to be that different if this character chooses A or B, or, you know, gets to be sent down this path or that path? But talk about high stakes for every character in this book, and you just can't stop reading it. So I wanted to ask you, you know, I think we often have like these seeds that are kind of planted in our lives for a book. It's not usually like one aha moment, at least in my experience. There's a lot of little things that come together over time. And then for some reason, at some moment, there is this kind of click where you just say, oh, this is the story. And all these little things I was thinking about go together.
Mhm.
How did it all come to be, this book, for you?
First of all, thank you so much for doing this with me, Courtney. You are not only a dear friend, but I've always admired your work so much, and I love your new book, which I would love to talk about as well. In fact, I read Kylie Reed's Such a Fun Age and your book, and I feel like they have a lot. That might be an off-camera conversation, because I was like, wow, this is a really zeitgeist moment. Courtney's new book, which is called Friends and Strangers, is kind of about the relationship between a caretaker, a babysitter caretaker person, and a new mother, and so is Such a Fun Age, and there are issues of race, class, and all kinds of exciting things. So I just wanted to say that I hope people will consider grabbing that at Watching Books as well. I'm sure a bunch of people here have already read it too. But yeah, so usually for me, it's exactly what you're describing, which is that I have ideas, and then I figure out, in that strange alchemy, they kind of come together. I think of it as you know, flypaper that things stick to, kind of. Or I think of myself as a magpie gathering bits and pieces and sort of figuring out how it works. And this book was a little different in that I read an article in the New York Times, and it immediately caught my attention, and I thought, this is my next book. But I didn't realize till I finished the book why it appealed to me. And I think that's another way into a story, you know, like that it's part of trusting your own sort of unconscious impulses, and not, this is getting very crafty all of a sudden, meaning talking about craft, but meaning there's this great quote that Verlin Klinkenborg said, which is, notice what you notice. And I love it because it sort of gives a writer permission to obsess over some things and not others, And when you do a book like the one that I just did with so much research, you can get overwhelmed with the things that you feel you should be focusing on versus the things you are drawn to. And so notice what you notice is kind of a way of saying, trust your instinct about
Yeah.
what direction to go in, trust what your eye falls on, or allow yourself that freedom that your unconscious mind is working and leading you towards something. Anyway, that's a very convoluted way to go back to your question and to say, when I finished the book, I realized there were about 4 different aspects of my past that had come together when I read this piece in the New York Times. So the article was, I don't know if you remember, Lisa Belkin used to have a column called Mother Load. It was before you were a mother, but I was a mother and my kids were younger. And so I read it, all the time. And she had a very unusual column one day, which was about the convict women who were sent on these ships, repurposed slaving ships, to Australia with their children, a lot of them with children. And it was about what that journey was like for women and babies and young children. And as I read it, I thought, I don't know about this story. I want to know more about this story, and it seems like a really interesting topic. But on the surface, it doesn't have anything to do with my life. I mean, I'm not Australian. I'm not a convict. I'm also, so I should step back and just say that this novel that I wrote, The Exiles, is the story of the convict women who transformed Australia and the Aboriginal people whose way of life was destroyed when colonists landed on their shores. So again, these things seem to have nothing to do with my life. But when I was in my 20s, I was a Rotary Fellow to Australia, and I had an amazing time. And for 6 weeks, I toured timberland preserves in a little blue jacket and went to Rotary meetings all over, and toured frozen food factories and cheese farms.
Wow.
Yeah, I got it was so fun, actually. I wish I could do it in America because I learned so much about the way things are made. It's kind of like one of those children's books that focuses on, how things are produced, and it's very interesting. And I read the Robert Hughes book, The Fatal Shore, sort of in preparation. My father had spent a year teaching in Australia with my family when I was in college, and I couldn't go. He gave me the book. Loved it. But there was only one chapter in the entire huge 688-page history of Australia that was devoted to the Aboriginal people and convict women. In fact, one chapter together it was called Bunters, Mollies, and Sable Brethren, which is what they called convict women and Aboriginal people. So I read that one chapter. I remember being in my 20s and reading that book, and that was the chapter I was most interested in. And I wanted to learn more then. And when I went to Australia and tried to talk about this with people, I encountered quite a bit of resistance. They weren't quite ready at the time. It was many years ago, and things have changed a bit since then. But I found resistance. Anyway, I got back into my own life in America. I wrote a book on feminism with my mom, and we interviewed 60 mothers and daughters of the women's movement, the second wave. And and it was really interesting. And what was most interesting about that to me was that it really taught me a lot about the power of telling your own story, of these women telling their stories. And after that, I went and taught in a women's prison. So these are all related.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
wow.
The Australia piece, the women's prison, because I taught college, but I felt like I wanted to teach I wanted to work with people writing memoir who had never perhaps had the opportunity to tell their stories before. So I taught at the only all-female prison in New Jersey, the Edna Mahan facility, and I taught in Supermax. There are 700 inmates, 300 in maximum security, I believe, and 100 in what they called Supermax, which is kind of the lifers. And so that was very intense.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did you do that? Do you just do you just literally go and say, I want to teach writing here? Or is it part of a program?
They were like,
or?
What? They were not, I just wrote, someone had a contact at a prison, and I wrote that person, and she was like, I don't know, we've never done that. So
Wow.
there were a lot of steps to doing it. But I do have friends, all kinds of friends who teach in prisons. In fact, I was talking to a poet yesterday about, she teaches in a prison in California. My friend Monica Wood has done it in the Maine Correctional Facility. So Wally Lamb does it, who's another novelist, or has done it in Massachusetts. And I got some good advice about doing it when I did it. But anyway, so all of these bits and pieces kind of came together. So my interest in the criminal justice movement, criminal justice reform, based on my experience at the prison, this book on feminism and women telling their stories, and then the whole Australia piece. And I think after I finished the book, I realized those things were all present in me when I read that article and was like, holy moly, this is exciting.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating because I think, oftentimes we would say like, oh, I read this article and it inspired me, and it did. But as you said, you call it the fly paper. My friend Ann Napolitano calls it your magnet board. The different things will stick to different writers for different reasons. And other people might read the same article and find it fascinating or whatever, but they're not going to still be thinking about it years later. So for some reason for you, all of these pieces, that makes so much sense. They all kind of flow together into this incredible story. And this book, I don't know, it's the kind of, it's just so masterful. I have a hard time like getting my head around it, because it's one thing to say this, I would like to write a novel about this, but it's a really hard world, it would seem to me, to bring to life so vividly, which you do. And I just wanted to know, how the heck did you do that? So, I mean, clearly you had to do tons of research, but when I'm reading this book, I'm full of it's like the best possible use of research, is what you've done, because I feel like I'm in the hands of a master storyteller and you're just taking me on this journey. And I don't feel like you're saying, oh, I have to give you some information. So in 1841, there was, no, I don't feel that. I feel like I'm just living it. And so how do you do that? How do you write a historical novel, do the research? I'd also love to know a little bit about what your research was for this book and how you did it. But then how do you take that and turn it into such a compelling story?
I mean, that's the thing, is that the story has to be primary. And to be honest with you, I get sent a lot of historical novels because I'm writing these novels set in the past. And I find, I mean, some people are incredible, but I do find that I feel like I'm having research shoved at me in some historical fiction. And I hate that. I hate it. In this novel, what I cared most about were the characters and the story. And so I had to be ruthless with myself. No matter how much research I did on one particular subject, I had to just jettison it if it wasn't going to be what the character saw, felt, ate, touched. All this stuff ended up on the cutting room floor because as I went through it again and again, draft after draft, my goal was, what is relevant to this character now? Otherwise, it has to be cut. I could write a treatise about how logs were felled in the forest, and and the sheep that came in, brought millions of sheep brought by the British that overtook the Aboriginal hunting grounds. I did mention that detail, but I didn't go on and on the way I had written it originally. So there was a lot of that, of kind of trying to figure out exactly what was relevant and what wasn't relevant. Sometimes when you do all the research, you're like a good student with you need your gold star by showing that you did the work. And you just have to get over that if you're a novelist, because the only thing that matters is that people are immersed in the story and that it feels organic, it feels alive. And that's the hardest part. I'm inherently not great at structure, so I rely on other people's ideas of structure to help me. So, for example, my first novel, Sweetwater, is the structure of Sweetwater is the Oresteia by Aeschylus, which is a series of 3 plays.
Fascinating.
And I even have, it's the same story, except set in the South in the present day, such as it was in 1995 or whatever it was. But I like Orestes in the Oresteia is Horace in the book, and Clytemnestra is Clyde, the grandmother. You know, I that helped me write that book.
Have you done that with every one of your novels?
You know, now that I think about it, I probably have in one way or another. But what I was going to say about this novel is that it's actually, I've never done this before. It is The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. It really is, except that it goes through 3 characters, so that it's not one hero. It actually, I envision the novel as a kind of passing of the baton from one convict to the next. And as the story is passed from one person to the next, these literal things are passed. There's a necklace, there's a handkerchief, you know, and then there are some metaphorical things. There is some knowledge, like one character loves the Tempest and she passes her love of the Tempest along, not to mention the skill of literacy. She teaches it to the next person. So, and then that person teaches it to the next person. There's a way that I saw this novel as a kind of single thread that was spread through 3 people. And that doesn't include the Aboriginal girl, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, but Mathina, whose story is threaded through and has a different sort of intersection with the plot. But for those convict women, that was super helpful to me to read Joseph Campbell and to kind of think about this epic journey, because really this is the first book I've ever written that is an epic journey like this.
It is.
And maybe the last.
And I think it's strange because, I mean, within the last 6 months, I have not really gone anywhere. So when I was reading this book, I felt like I was on a journey in a way that was wonderful and enjoyable, but also very strange because the journey was on a ship like sailing for a penal colony. So I was like, but I felt that the bigness of it is so incredible. And the characters are so incredible. So I wanted to know, did you base your characters on specific real people, or more just like, did you look at the stories of different women and they were sort of composites?
Yeah, I read a lot of convict stories of these convict women. I worked with this incredible woman whom I stalked and made work with me. My last 3 novels, I have found experts who are all female, all in their 70s, I believe, and who have written extensively. So Orphan Train, I worked with this woman who's the daughter of a train rider who's written many books, wonderful books, nonfiction about her mother and about the orphan trains and stuff. And she was definitely a portal into the world of the orphan trains. And through her, she ran the New York Train Riders Association in Little Falls, Minnesota. And, and I went to these reunions and stuff with her, which was great. And then with A Piece of the World, I worked with a tour guide from the Olson house in Maine. So Piece of the World is the story of this woman who was the muse for Andrew Wyeth for the painting Christina's World. And so I was taking a tour of the house when I just had the germ of this idea. And there was a very pleasant 22-year-old college student tour guide who was telling nice anecdotes about the Olson house, which is in Maine. And I was taking notes. And I felt this woman yank my arm, and she pulled me over, and she was quite intimidating. And she said, "Why are you taking notes?" And I said, and then I said, well, I don't know, but I'm thinking about writing about this. And she said, well, I have been giving tours since this house opened to the public many years ago, and I know everything.
Wow.
Handed me her card. And then she's like a professional tour guide. She also she lives in, Florida in the winter, and she gives tours at the Ringling Brothers house, whatever.
Oh, interesting.
Barnum, yeah. The mansion, whatever that is. And so I visited her there, and she went on tour with me all over the place. It was very funny. And we're still good friends. She just texted me to say, "Did you know you're a New York Times bestseller?" I was like, "Yes."
Oh, I love
Um,
that.
She's just very sweet. But sorry, long way of saying, I went online to sort of start my research, and I discovered the website of this retired professor named Dr. Alison Alexander, who's written 33 books about convict women, about Australian history, all of this stuff. And she became sort of my muse, I guess. She was just fantastic. And through her, I'm getting back to your question. Through her, I read all these convict stories and learned. That was my entree into. I ordered, because they're not available in America, so I ordered from her website all these books of hers, and I have a whole big collection of her wonderful books. And then when I went to Australia, we had dinner together every night. She and her husband made dinner, and I hung out with them, with my sister Cynthia, and we just had a great time. She took me to all these places that were convict sites and all of that. So long story short, the book begins with Evangeline, who is a governess who is educated, and for whom this experience of being thrown into the world of being accused of a crime that she didn't really commit and ending up in Newgate prison and then on her way to Australia was new. All of that was new. It was a great shock to her. So for me, the character of Evangeline was a stand-in for the reader. You know, we're literally, you know, you're reading a book, we're readers, she's a reader. She leads a life without really understanding what it means to be on the bottom rungs of the social ladder and end up in prison. And most of us probably haven't been to prison who are reading the book. So I thought it would be a way into the story that would make it more of a journey, I think, because you're experiencing every new thing as Evangeline does.
Yes.
And then by the time we get to Hazel, who is scrappy, street smart, grew up, you know, as I said, at the bottom rungs of the ladder, none of this is a surprise to her. She's fully expected that she might end up in this situation. And by the time we get to her, what we need is an expert. And Hazel is an expert. She has a superpower. I thought of her as a superhero, in fact. She's 60 years old, weighs about 85 pounds, and is, you know, utterly just made of steel, right? And because she knows how to heal, she knows with herbs and flowers and other witchy potions how to both heal and hurt, and that ability saves her life and the lives of other people over and over. And I saw that as a really interesting on the ground once you get to Australia, having someone like that who could change her own destiny in a way that most women in the prison could not would be a useful. So that's sort of how I formulated those characters. One who has no useful skills at all. I mean, she's literate, she's memorized poetry, she can speak Greek and Latin, but none of that really matters by the time she's on the ship. The only thing she can do is find people who can help her survive, and that's part of it, you know. But she has a very important, that you learn on the first page of the book, she has a very important thing to pass along, and that is the legacy, to her own legacy to a child.
Yes. When did you start writing this book?
I guess my books are about 2 years altogether of writing and research. And then, you know, it's always another year till the book comes out. So my book, I don't write. I mean, I did an event with John Grisham the other night. He publishes 2 books a year at this point. He's like, yeah, I'm bored. So I just have to start another book when I finish a book. I just have to. And so he's like, basically, he literally surprised his publisher last March. He just handed it an extra book. He was like, yeah, you know, I came up with an idea and they really don't know they didn't know what to do with it because it screwed up my whole publication schedule that I'm writing too many books. I was like, no, that's not the way I work at all. First of all,
never have that problem. I've never had that problem.
Never have that problem. I have too many kids and life, too many sisters, too much stuff going on.
I know. I feel like I'm never bored. I'm always more just overwhelmed than bored. But
and how many
feel like,
can I just ask you, how many years are you between books?
You know, most of my books, they take 2 years to write, and then Saints for All Occasion took 4 years. So I thought I was like a 2 years person, you know, but that
Yeah.
one kind of shook me up. Now I'm like, I don't really know how long it takes me to write a book, but usually about 2 years. Um, but I asked that because I just feel like since Trump was elected, every fiction writer I know is wrestling with living in an America that in a world that is ever changing and ever more disturbing, and not just Trump being elected, but also, you know, revelations about climate change that have come out in the last few years, and of course in the last 6 months, where like everything is coming home to roost. But I feel like the writers I know have taken these different approaches, because when we are writing fiction, even though it's fiction, that it is actually this sort of like, you know, dart right to the center of the dartboard of human experience, right? So like fiction sometimes tells a deeper truth than, you know, reality. So some people I know have been writing about this present moment, and where we are. I feel like my new book is very much like, how did we get here?
Yeah.
But still pretty contemporary. And then some people are writing something like, I had this thought when I started writing a new book that I can either kind of write about what's happening, or I have to just go totally in a different direction, like just something fanciful, something fun or whatever. But I feel like your book, it's coming out at this moment when it feels so resonant to what's happening currently. So it's interesting to me to hear that you worked in a prison, that you were teaching writing in a prison, because it just has such an important, I don't want to say message, because I don't like the word message with fiction, but you know, it had me thinking so much about policing and power and what it means to be considered a convict. You know, one of the things that's come out during this whole conversation about policing that's been happening in recent months is, have you ever noticed that the story of criminals is always told from the point of view of the police officer? Usually, you know, like every television show about crime and punishment is the police officer's point of view, and that's the person we find out their backstory, and the criminals are the one who are there for one episode, right? But the police are the heroes.
Yeah.
And in this book, you know, I felt so invested in these women's stories, and you feel so indignant on their behalf. And I think there's the issue of, you know, you talk about really directly in the book, and also it just is infused throughout the whole book, the idea of different rules for rich and poor. And that is
Yeah.
certainly something we see every day in this culture too.
Yeah.
And also this thing about using women's fertility, using motherhood, to control, to punish. And so I just wondered, you know, as you were writing it, were you thinking about our modern kind of struggles with these issues? Because it felt very modern in those ways to me.
You know, I know this is going to sound funny because it's set in the 1840s, but it's a very modern book. I mean,
It is.
the book is, I was very much, well, Courtney, you and I were both involved. You were really involved. I just gave a little bit of money, but you were really involved in the children in cages stuff, which by the way, seems like 1,000 years ago. They're still there.
Yes.
It's just that there have been so many disasters since.
Yes.
But
Yes.
you know, but I was thinking very much about the children in cages and parents
Yeah.
separated from children. And that's what I wrote about in the book. And it's actually factually accurate. All the stuff I described, the mothers being separated from their children, the children being put in an orphanage, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And often permanently losing them. But the whole book was written in the shadow of our historical moment now. And it felt very, very much that I was writing about the current day in some ways, about power imbalance, as I said, about, you know, about the criminal justice system, about gender and race. All of those things are huge in this book in a way that I haven't done in any of my other books. And part of what I mean when I say it is in some ways a contemporary novel is that I think Hilary Mantel gave all of us permission who write about the past to do this when she said, yes, my books take place 600 years ago or whatever, but I want you to feel that the characters are contemporary. The way I even structure dialogue is the way we talk today, not necessarily the way they talked then. She said, what I did in this novel is I tried not to be anachronistic, and I used an etymology dictionary to make sure that the language was the right language, not of my prose, but of the dialogue. But the dialogue, the way it's structured, is actually modern. It reads more the way people talk today than the way they talked, especially English people in Australia in the 1840s. And that was conscious. I wanted the story to feel that you, the reader, are in it, in the moment of it.
Yes.
This is not a book someone would have written in 1840. This is a book that someone would write in 2020. And I was very clear about that to my editor, and it's what I want to do anyway. I have some trouble with the whole historical novelist thing. I feel that it's a female ghetto in a lot of ways. There's a whole conversation to be had about it. And if you want to read the article I wrote about it, it's on my website. It's for poets and writers. But I do, however, think that of all my books, this is the most clearly a historical novel. It's completely set in the past. And there was an amazing piece by Jill Lepore, who's a journalist and a brilliant writer, and it was in the New Yorker a few years ago, and it's called Just the Facts, Ma'am. And she says, fiction does what history doesn't, but should, which is to tell the story of ordinary men. And she went on to say, and who are these ordinary men? Well, a lot of them are women. And I thought, when I read that, I felt such recognition. I felt such a sense of recognition, because that's definitely what I've been doing in my last 3 books in particular, is looking essentially at hidden lives, stories that people don't know a lot about. And often, of course, those are women because they haven't had a public voice. So so Robert Hughes writes the history of Australia, and the indigenous people and women are relegated to one chapter because that's the way the world has been. That's the way history has been written. I mean, I am obsessed with Robert Hughes, and he's the best writer. I recently reread that book, when I was researching this, and I was again bowled over by how great it is. At the same time that I thought he would, I hope, write a different book today, a more inclusive book today. But so that was fascinating to understand. And also, this was not, it was not a sort of sending females from Britain to Australia was a calculated attempt on the part of the British government to populate Australia. They were sent as breeders, essentially. And that aspect of the story, most of these stories where Britain colonizes, I would say all of the stories in which my ancestors in England, colonized people, have these horrific elements. And they sent all these prisoners to Australia. By the early 19th century, Australia was 9-to-1 men to women. And so they began devising flimsy pretenses for sweeping women off the streets and sending them over. And you know what happened? They populated Australia. It actually did happen. So I think I found all of that research really politically interesting. And
did any of those women go back to England after they'd served their time, or it was really impossible for them to do so?
It was almost impossible to do so. It was so expensive. It was a 4 to 6 month journey. Also, the conditions were horrific too. So you didn't necessarily want to get back on a ship and, make the journey around Africa. But the women, even if they got a 7-year sentence, it was essentially a life sentence to the land beyond the seas. Imagine being sent with nothing to an entirely different continent on the other side of the world. It was quite an amazing thing that it happened.
I have so many more questions. I think we need to turn it over to the
yes.
audience for questions, but I have so many more I want to ask you. And we actually haven't really gotten into the Indigenous
I know.
aspect of the book. Should we talk about that for a minute before we do switch over? Because I feel like it's so important, and I feel it's just something, another element of this book I was so blown away by, because you embody this character who is a young Indigenous girl who is essentially, treated as like a pet by this British aristocrat. I mean, she just decides she's going to take her for her own amusement out of her world, out of her life. And I wondered about her too. Where did she sort of first come from? And it's interesting that you talked about that chapter in that book that your dad gave you,
Yes.
and how it wove the two together, because your book weaves the two together so beautifully as well.
You're so right. Yeah, it does. It does weave the two together. So so as you know, the germ of the novel was about the convict women, and that's what I thought I would write about. But when I got to Australia and actually began to research, I realized that it would be irresponsible for me not to somehow address the story of the Aboriginal people at the same time that I was terrified about doing so, because we live in a climate, rightly so, where, where there's a lot of conversation, as there should be, about who has permission to tell a story. And I wrestled with this a lot. And honestly, if I could have gotten away without doing it, I would have, because I didn't want to take on something that would ever feel as if I were appropriating a story. But I had to take the risk because it wasn't accurate not to include it. And it also felt wrong, morally wrong, not to mention it. And so what I did is I found the story of a real person, Mathina, who had lived in this exact place at this exact time. And what I describe in the novel is exactly what happened to her. She was the daughter of a chieftain who she was orphaned. And Sir John Franklin, who later became an Arctic explorer, who was very famous and eventually disappeared with his crew in the Arctic. He and his wife, Lady Jane, had been brought to Tasmania, which was then Van Diemen's Land, to be governor. And Lady Jane was the social chair, basically, of the whole place. So they visited the essentially open air concentration camp where all the Aboriginal people had been put on Flinders Island. And they saw this beautiful, by all accounts, incredibly charismatic, beautiful young girl dancing. She had to do a dance for them. And when she was done, they said to each other, let's see if we can turn her into a lady. Let's take her in. We'll dress her in fine clothes, teach her French, teach her to do English dances, and then maybe we'll present her to, we'll get a tutor for her. And so they did exactly that. And they took her in and they paraded her in front of other people. And it was, they thought they were being, so enlightened to have this Aboriginal girl living in their household, but they neglected her. The way they talked about her, many of those are quotes from their journals, from biographies of them, from other books that mention them, people who went to the governor's house and met Mathina. And then when Sir John was called back to London, they abandoned her and left her. So all of that is true. Wow. And so the way I intersect the stories is that Hazel, the convict maid, as they were called, went to work in the governor's house where Mathina was living, and that was how their stories came together. But I just want to say one last thing about Mathina's story. In real life, and I don't think I talk about this on my website, there's a whole lot about Mathina and about her real life story as well, and pictures too. And the portrait in the red dress that I describe in the novel is on my website. But in real life, she had a really tragic end. They abandoned her. She was caught between worlds. She couldn't her own people, she didn't have anything in common with them anymore, didn't even speak the language anymore. The white people were, not nice. And so she really was sort of a wanderer. And then at the age of 17, she drowned, and she
Oh.
was found dead. They don't know if it was murder or suicide or if it was a drunken mistake, but it was just this tragic end. And so I wanted in this novel to end on a moment of connection instead of playing it out to that end. And I did the same thing in my previous novel with Christina Olson. I ended it with her and Andrew Wyeth on a moment of connection before, in her real life, things got very hard for her and
Yeah.
physically difficult and everything. So I don't, you make these choices and you're not sure how they work, but that's what I
Do you
did.
think you did that for the reader, or do you think you did that because you yourself had fallen in love with her by then, or both, or neither?
I just didn't want to end with her death. I felt like that was just so hard. I mean, there's a lot in the book that's hard. And then but I don't think it's even though there's a lot of intense stuff, I think ultimately it ends, in a hopeful way. I wasn't trying to sugarcoat anything with Mathena, but the other reality of my novel is that it only takes place over 4 years, and that would have been a
Right.
whole different thing. So,
Well, I think that's part of why this book felt kind of miraculous to me, because you did not sugarcoat anything. So it is really heavy, but it doesn't feel heavy. It feels like an adventure as you're going through it. But I did feel as a reader such joy that there was a little bit of lightness and hope ultimately. But I was also amazed as a reader and as a writer by how you really just kind of continuously like went for it throughout this book and didn't give everybody a happy ending.
right.
And,
Yeah.
I won't give anything away, but I will say there's one thing in this book, and you already know what it is because I already told you. And if anyone listening or watching has read the book, then you also probably know what it is. That's one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen in a novel. I was like, I just couldn't believe it was happening, and it happened. It was such a bold writerly choice. I was like, this is not possible. She can't be doing this. And I was thinking of ways that it could not be the thing that I thought it was, but of course it was. Anyway,
I know.
audience questions.
Okay, are there questions?
Now, how do I find them? Let me see.
And I'm just going to say one more thing, which is that this is the first novel I've ever written that has a real ending, meaning you find out what happens to people. And it felt very satisfying to jump forward in time and really say, okay, here's how it played out. And I love too that I end the novel at exactly the same place that I start the novel, of the story of the convict women, and that felt very complete. I've never, and in that way, it feels like an old-fashioned book to me, in that kind of like story way.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful conversation. As you know, I'm a huge fan of the book. I read it, I devoured it, and I'm so excited for you that it's on the New York Times bestseller list, and deservedly so. And we do have a bunch of questions. Our first, we have a kind of multi-pronged question from Emma Justice, just to start out with. And she wants to know, what is Dr. Allison's last name? That's the beginning.
If I could type it, I would tell you. Go to my website because I have a lot of information about her. Just under Exiles, you'll see. But her name is Allison Alexander.
Okay.
And she is Australian. If you just Google her name, Dr. Allison Alexander, you'll see her. She's just wonderful. I think I have pictures of us together on my website, maybe. I think I do.
Awesome. I'm sending it to everyone. And then Emma also says that she talks about the importance of seeing women as criminals, as people with value, may help us make a better criminal justice system. If we ever want to rehab people, we have to value them. So
Yeah, I thought about that a lot. I thought about that so much as I was reading the book, as I was writing the book, and about the way also that people, I mean, one of the things I learned teaching in this women's prison was that people find joy wherever they are. You know, you're in prison perhaps for life, and it's pretty grim actually, and not beautiful. And yet there are all kinds of ways that the women I taught found joy in their day-to-day lives. And that was one of the reviews of this book said that it's Orange is the New Black for the 1800s. I was like, funny. But I know what they mean in that it is about the kind of friendships between prisoners and you know and conflicts too. But yeah.
So here I have one from Helen, who also wants to say, not a question, but wanted to say that you are an amazing writer, which I agree with. And she says, do you think that this book, just like Orphan Train, could be used with students? And if so, what age groups?
That's a good question. I mean, Orphan Train, Orphan Train is, I think people read it in school starting at age 13 or something. You know, I mean, I'm not sure. This book is a little bit more adult in some ways, in that it's not a 17-year-old narrator the way or central character. Well, no, they're teenagers too. I don't know. It's a little bit grimmer than Orphan Train, perhaps. What do you think, Courtney? Oh, you're muted.
I muted myself because my dog was barking again.
Oh.
It is interesting because my first thought was the same thing that you said, that, well, but these characters are older. And then I thought, well, no, she's only 16,
Yeah.
right?
I know.
But she seems, I don't know, she seems to be I guess the story of Orphan Train feels like it's a story about children. And even though
It
these
is. You're right.
young women these young women are sort of just barely into their young womanhood, but it doesn't seem as much a story for children. I don't know.
The
Why is
situation
that?
is so adult. I think it's so adult,
Yeah.
and they're immediately thrust into this world of, you know, a harrowing kind of world. And so
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Well,
There's
and
so
also,
many terrible things for children to learn about the history of our world. It's awful.
Yes, there are. There sure are.
she has sex, right?
What's
And
that? Yes.
so that's part of what makes it seem a little bit more mature. But if anyone ever got punished for having sex, it's
Mm,
She did. That's true.
yeah.
so
Yeah.
Art wants to know, can you talk about Olive?
Oh, I love Olive. So I just read E.M. Forster's aspects of the novel, and he talks about how, and I love this, he says it's very important to have, of course, you have to have round characters, right? But that flat characters are equally important in a novel, and that you have to have part of the goal, and what makes a novel successful, he said, is to have really compelling flat characters. And I think that Olive is a really compelling flat character. Don't you think so, Courtney? I mean, she's meaning we don't have access to her inner life. All we know is what she presents to the central voices, the central characters. But there's so much richness in her because she is bawdy, she's funny. Nobody else is really funny. She doesn't care about the rules. She's a rule breaker. She's a what's the word? Not jester. There's a word, trickster. She's my trickster character. And I think every novel needs a trickster character because they're so much fun, and they, you know, you throw them into any situation and they kind of behave in ways that surprise you. And so even though Olive isn't one of my main, you know, narrators, essentially, she is definitely a big presence. And she is at pivotal moments, she changes the story. She is responsible for the story moving forward in all these ways. And so she was just such a fun character to create. You could write a whole novel. Someone could write a whole novel about Olive.
I think you feel, as a reader, you feel so much relief when a character in peril finds a friend, so Olive was just such a relief to me because, okay, finally someone is going to actually see Evangeline as herself and actually care about her, even though she's so different from Evangeline. So I love that. And I love what you said about how she propels the story to new places, even if she is if she is a flat, not round character.
She's also the truth teller. And so I was doing a writing workshop where I was explaining how I did this. I mean, whatever. With Olive, I was able to use Olive in this way that was so helpful to me because she actually tells the history of the convict trade, how the convict women ended up going there. She does it all in this sort of off the cuff way. And so I get in some really important information that doesn't feel like a lecture through her perspective, because she's teaching Evangeline, who knows nothing about how the world works, and she's sort of rolling her eyes and saying, "Oh my God, you're so naive. I have to convey all this to you." But in doing so, she does a lot of heavy lifting for me, the writer. So yeah, so that was a great discovery, this Olive person.
Okay, so here's another one. This is from Laura. Has it been released in Australia yet? What are reactions? And if it is not yet released, what do you anticipate the reactions will be?
Well, that's a very good question. It's being released in the UK and Australia on October 15th. And I've been doing a bunch of pre-pub stuff for that. But I did an event the other night with Heather Morris, who lives in Melbourne and wrote The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which, by the way, I reviewed. So I'm glad that I liked it. But she was lovely. But the first thing she said was, I picked up this book with a lot of trepidation. Not only did you think that you could write about Australia, but you also then wrote about our Aboriginal population, and I was not sure how I was going to feel about it. And she went on to say that, I mean, I think she wouldn't have done the event if she hadn't liked the book. And she went on to say that, that she was surprised to really like the book. The truth is, my own family background is that I have dual citizenship. I'm English and American, and I lived in England for 9 years, and I grew up there when I was little. My dad's a professor of British history, and so I felt a lot of authority writing about Evangeline and about London and about these British convicts. I mean, just from my own past. But the other stuff, it's true, was a leap. But we'll see. I don't know. I don't know how it will go. You know what? I don't live there, so I don't need to listen if they hate it.
Here's another question. This one is from Beth Miller. You mentioned that sometimes you struggle with structure in a novel. Why do you think that this is the most challenging thing for authors?
Well, it is for me because I just don't think that way. I don't think it's a challenge for John Grisham, and probably not for Jodi Picoult. I mean, people who really do structure well and have blockbusters seem to get it like that. I'm just more interested in character. So I'm more interested in what's going on inside than what's going on outside. So I have written, let's just say I've written a novel or two where not much happens. Let's just put it that way. So, I mean, I'm just more interested in how things happen than what happens. But this novel is such an adventure that I was telling my husband as I was working on it, like, this is crazy. I can't believe I am writing a novel with such a big plot. Like, this is strange. And it was kind of liberating in a funny way. Because my last book, nothing happened. Speaking of nothing happened, this woman never left her house. I mean, I wrote an entire 300-page novel about a woman who almost never left her home. And at every moment of drama in that novel was emotional drama, and it was all, I had to manufacture it all. So this in some ways was easier, just to have this story that was, they were moving forward, literally moving in the story.
Well, I'm not seeing, okay, here is another question. This is from Sarah Ann. I thought it was a brave choice regarding what happened to Evangeline, and when. Can you talk about that decision? Thank you.
Well, I don't want to give anything away, so I'm not going to say too much, except that, you know, I think I was influenced by the kinds of surprises that can happen in Greek drama, not to mention Game of Thrones. You know, I wanted the reader to really understand, and there were other moments like this too, but to really understand that things happen, unexpected things happen in real life, and I sort of wanted to catch the reader off guard, I guess. I'm trying to figure out how to talk about it, but I don't think I can say much more right now.
Definitely caught me off guard. I have a question for you, Christina. Is there one thing or a couple of things that you really want the reader to take away from this book? What would your ideal reader's experience be from this book?
Gosh, I mean, I think more than anything, I hope it's memorable to people, and that this piece of history that a lot of people don't know much about inspires people to learn more. I like that idea that people will read the book and go on to sort of look things up and see what the true story was of this. But also that they'll think about the fact that these things really, this world existed, and we're all still coming to terms as Americans with with our past, with Native American, how Native Americans were treated by the British again, and by Americans, and then, you know, the whole slavery piece as well. In some ways, the story of the Aboriginal people is sort of a combination of our two real great injustices, the Native American piece and the African American piece, because Aboriginal people are still discriminated against on the basis of, you know, race, and they were also pushed off their land the way the Native Americans were here. So there are all of these things that I think are relevant to us as American readers as well. And, you know, certainly I do a slideshow for these latest books. When I travel, I have a slideshow, and I did one for this book that I think is, I wish I could show it, but I'm not traveling yet, and maybe I will be for the paperback. But in it, I actually do draw these lines to the present day, and I have pictures from, for example, the Black Lives Matter in America really spread, as we know, all over the world. And there in Australia, there were and still are all movements of recognition, reparations, you know, all kinds of stuff. So there's a lot going on in the moment that is directly related to all the issues that I do address in the book.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So I have another question from Emma. Well, it's not a question. What she said was, women have kids, men have wives with kids. And that was in reference to John Grisham. He says writers often have families. So she says, don't be critical. Matter if they take more time.
I kind of lost some of that because of
My
you were
dog.
falling.
Okay, I can say it again. So Emma says women have kids, men have wives with kids, when you were talking about Grisham's accomplishments. So she says women writers often have families. Don't be critical of your fine accomplishments, no matter if they take more time.
You know, to be honest with you, I don't aspire to write a book a year, and I never will. I don't want to. My books cook more slowly, and that's the way I like it. So I respect what people do, who like Jody, who write a book a year, and wow, that work is amazing. I need things to cure longer for myself, and it takes what the time it takes, and I'm okay with it. And also, as I said, I I don't only prioritize my writing, so I have other things that I like to do too.
Okay, here's one from Lauren saying, not to rush you, but do you have an idea for what your next book will be about?
That's a good, is this our final question? That's a good one to end on. I don't know if we're, how we are for time, but whatever
do
you
have-
think.
One more quip from someone that I think would be great to end on after this.
Okay, that's perfect. Yes, I do have an idea, and it's a crazy great idea, if I do say so myself. I don't know if I can pull it off, but it's really cool. I wanted to write a contemporary novel because these books take so much work to research, but then I rediscovered a family story, which is about two sisters, my mother's great aunts in rural North Carolina at the time of the Civil War. And that's all I'll say for now, but it's just this very interesting story. And I couldn't not do it. So that's what I'm doing. And it's so foolhardy, I have to say, because the people who care about the Civil War know a lot about the Civil War. And to try to write about it when I have never done more than read Shelby Foote and seen Civil War movies is ridiculous. I don't know what I think I'm doing, but we'll see. It felt too perfect to not take on. So yeah. Do you have a next idea, Courtney?
Hold on, sorry. I muted again because the dog. I didn't want my dog to be barking over you, Christina. I am working on a book that's sort of a ghost story. I don't know. It's set in Maine. I have had no childcare for 6 months, but it starts again tomorrow. So I'm hoping I will actually write when that happens. But I feel like, you know, you always want to feel kind of like you can't do the next thing. Like it has to scare you a little bit and feel impossible. Otherwise, it's not worth it. So I think you seem to be on the right path with that feeling of, oh my gosh, what am I doing? That's always the best book. That always leads to the best thing. It's
both that you can't do it, or that you're afraid you can't do it, and that you can't not do it. It's that awful.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
Like, you have to do it, but you don't know if you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't go on, I must go on. Isn't that
exactly. Exactly.
Waiting for Godot? Yeah.
Okay, so we have two more questions. One is, and then that's it. Okay, so Laura wants to know, what novelists do you read for ultimate enjoyment, not for research?
That's such a good question. You have to answer this too. I don't know. I have been talking about this book though first of all, I love Courtney's writing. So I have to say, even if I weren't talking with her, of course I would have read her book because it's wonderful. It's true. It's absolute pleasure. I read All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Toews, Toews. I don't know how you pronounce it. And I just thought every aspect of it was brilliant. And I would say Elena Ferrante's new novel, which I'm just starting, is one that I'm jumping into because I've read all her other stuff and I'm a little obsessed with her, like it appears the entire world is. But what about you, Courtney?
You know, one of my sort of books of the year this year was Lily King's Writers and Lovers. I just loved it so much. I think it's just perfect. I just love that novel. And I love Euphoria too, her novel before that, which is so different. But I remember writing her, I didn't know her at the time, writing her and saying I thought Euphoria was this perfect novel. And I just couldn't believe it. It's kind of like The Exiles, where it just sort of, it seems as a reader like it just appeared out of thin air, but I know as a writer it was extremely hard to do. You know, that same kind of real research and projecting yourself into this world that was a real world, but doing it with really embodying these characters in such a three-dimensional way. So I love her books. I just read Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, which I also thought was just magnificent. So good.
I haven't read that one. That's great. I'll look forward to it.
So, and now finally, not a question. This is from Arden. During the Clinton impeachment, I met an Australian who said, "I'm so glad we got the convicts and you got the Puritans."
That's funny. Well, I'll just end by saying the only reason Australia got the convicts is that we won the Revolutionary War. They were sending all their convicts here. We had 50,000 British convicts in the colonies. And in fact, Samuel Johnson said, America is a race of convicts and should be treated as such. And Benjamin Franklin said in an editorial, he said, if Britain is in the habit of sending their convicts to the colonies, we should send bags of live rattlesnakes in retaliation back to them. I just thought that was very funny. So, you know, America sort of started that way too, and then we got our freedom, and the Brits had to figure out some other solution, and that's how it happened.
But did those convicts who got sent to America stay in America, or did
Yeah,
they go back?
They did.
Yeah.
They did their 7 or 14 years, and for sure, yes. In fact, I suspect that my father is descended from them. We
Wow.
don't know his family history, but they're sort of hill people from Georgia, and I'm suspecting that they might be.
Interesting.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much, and thank everybody for bearing with us through our technical difficulties. You know, Christina is such a favorite here in Montclair, and as this New York Times bestseller list proves, everywhere. And I just want to remind all of you that if you bought the $11 entry-only ticket, you can still apply the price to buy a signed copy of The Exiles from Watchung Booksellers anytime during the next week. And the booksellers have a list of all of the ticket holders' names. So you don't even have to fish out your receipt to do it. And I want to say that The Exiles and Christina's other books and Courtney's books, which includes her recent and very much acclaimed Friends and Lovers, are also available through the library, both digitally and in bound books or in audiobooks. And they're also available at Watchung Booksellers. And if you can't get enough Christina Baker Kline, please consider joining us for a free online discussion of The Exiles on Thursday, September 24th at 6 p.m. Christina will pop in to say hello for 15 minutes at the start of the season, at our session. Registration is required and it's very limited space, so do please sign up as soon as possible on the events page of the library website, montclairlibrary.org. Finally, don't forget to check out your handouts at the bottom of the screen, which have information about both participants, the book, and also a list of relevant reads for people who just love The Exiles and want more reads like that. And finally, we hope you'll join us for our next event, which is on Sunday, October 24th at 4 p.m. for Michael Schmidt in conversation about his incendiary New York Times bestseller, Donald Trump versus the United States. And now we'll have a word from Jackie at Succeed Together's Montclair Literary Festival. Jackie, can you come on?
Hi, thank you. That was such a great talk. I loved your book. I told you already, I read it in a day and a half. Not one day, but it was fantastic. So thank you everyone so much for supporting the Literary Festival, for coming to this event. And thanks Christina and Courtney and the Montclair Public Library for producing this talk.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you so much. Thank you, Courtney.
It was a pleasure. Thank you all.
And we hope to see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.